music. This is for the men who kissed me as if kissing their mothers on the cheek, and the ones who tongued me deeply, their hands roaming my body like a closed door in the dark. This is for their faith in their wanting, for the lines they drew in me like the ancients who mapped rivers in the spaces between the stars. Okay, so then because I don't get to read my poems about Esther Laurie, she's the artist I discovered who she haunted me for 2 years. And I wrote about 30 poems in response to her haunting. And this one is, so they're dated, located and dated. And this one is from a time when she, as an artist, was asked by the elders to go and make a drawing of the hospital, the children's hospital in the ghetto that the Nazis had burned to the ground, with the doctors and the nurses and the children in it. Kovno Ghetto, November 1941. She chooses an attic window for her frame. Her eye finds the place on the page that will center the orphaned chimney stack as the ink finds its way to the nib. Silence absorbs the memory of sounds. Locks click, splash of kerosene, screams of terror, screams of agony. Lines crawl onto her page, sprawl, a great dispossession of what the mind cannot unknow. All afternoon she sits, cross-hatched slashes of ink capture the collapsed roof, fill in the solid black of the single sagging rafter, shattered glass caught in sunlight, like stars that prick the winter sky, too far away to see their ashes. But still too close, she focuses. Lines crawl onto her page, sprawl toward the edges of her frame, tangle now and then, close up the field, smear when her ink thickens with cold. And as I said, she haunted me, and I started dreaming about her. And I tried to figure out about her family and who she was. She came from Palestine, went to visit her sister in Lithuania. She lived in Palestine, went to visit her sister in Lithuania at an inopportune moment. The Nazis invaded. So this is a meditation. Plymouth, February 2017. There is no other news of her sister who died in Auschwitz along with her son. No name for either, no footnote to explain why they were in Kovno in the first place. No brother-in-law, no extended family. Perhaps her name was one detail too many for the story. I have looked and looked for her face in the sketches of Kovno's inmates, but only find her in a photograph from Palestine, in which 5 siblings fill the field with steady gazes, their parents seated in their midst. Maybe she's the one taking the photograph at the beach on the North Sea in 1935, in which Esther stands straight back, sunglassed, smiling directly at the camera, dark curls lifted off her face by breeze. Or maybe she is the woman with her back to us, preferring not to be seen. The day they were driven out of Kovno in separate directions, where did Esther hide her sister's name? Okay, so my second book is the body dialogues. It looks all backwards to you, but that's what it says, the body dialogues. And I was so thrilled to have this come out from Lily Poetry Review Books just this January, just in time to be sequestered with it and not have reading. So Gloria, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to debut this book. And I'd like to read a poem from a series that I wrote in response. It was an ekphrastic exercise, and it was a still life of bottles, a row of bottles. And this is, I'm going to read you one of the poems I came up with. And it's also reflective of a true story. I went out on Route 6, David may know, I don't know if it's still there, somewhere on Route 6 down near Dennis, when bottle redemption first became a thing in Massachusetts. There was a huge sign on the side of the road that said, redemption, all kinds. And I've never forgotten that. So this is in the voice of the bottles. Bottle journal, end of Lent. Empties, they call us, at the little shack where the sign in front reads, redemption, all kinds. And we wonder which kind we'll get when we head out to give ourselves back. Will they welcome our collective light? We remember how they treated Jesus when he refused the bitter wine the Pharisees poured. How they feared that glass, reflecting the Father. How they thought, break the man, break the light inside him. When we're redeemed, we'll be smashed and our colors will bleed like a burn. Moss green, spider gold, chicory blue, shadow red too. This is a poem in parts, and it references a person named Aphrodite, and it's not the goddess, although in a way she is a goddess. It's from a story I heard about when the Syrian refugees started showing up on the shores of Lesbos. Field. 1. In the 100-acre field of mist that hovers above the grass, deer graze before dawn. Buttonbucks' tails flick white in the sheer, wet silver. Birds and crickets silenced by the dew's weight, the coral disk of sun just rising, a soul suspended over its abandoned body. 2. On Lesbos, the boats arrive in little fleets, out of the early fog or the solid dark of night. A small armada, they appear on the horizon. Their lights slip across the water, and from the shores, lights blink back. Aphrodite gives the children the clothes of her children. The blue field of the Aegean surges, the sand beneath their feet pulled back as they step ashore. She gives the grown-ups bread and tea, the children milk and bread. This is what it takes to tell the body, you are here. Oh, I lost the page number. Okay. So we're really good poets, right? With analogies, similes, metaphors. And following wherever that takes us. This poem is called Analogy. It's about watching what goes on in my world here, my green world. Choke cherries beside the brush pile, lean this way, then that as they discuss the wind. like young women around the well whose flat calves flex fluttering skirt hems as they haul up their buckets. April pours around them, chilly, ham-fisted, shutting each blossom's mouth. Each tree an adolescent girl who's just discovered how her nipples chafe against her shirt. And this is a poem after a William Stafford poem. And it's called The Kindness of Anecdote. The kindness of anecdotes is that they let you touch the story without commencing to think. They plant thistles in the clover, litter the lane with tiny birds that wait until you're close before they flit away. You can watch them and consider the lilies who never worry as you lift up the drowned boy, his red sneakered feet splayed on the shore, eyes not seeing the sun. You can place him in the bluebird box, nailed to the swamp maple's trunk, from which each morning he will hear you when you whistle the dog back from the field and ditch. And you, your heart will fold itself over him until he is another lamination of the darkness you carry. And I have two others that I'd like to read for you. I've been working with a wonderful group of poets from all over, and we Zoom. Annie knows, Annie's part of that group. And how many people have been renovating while you've been sequestered at home? Cleaning up those corners, emptying those closets. David, you're saying no?
No, tons.
Tons, okay. So I've lived in this house, my husband and I have lived in this house for 21 years. We finally stripped the wallpaper off the last bedroom. So this is called The Last Space. We imagine painted walls and freshly varnished floors, the dirt of past lives, dug from corners, wiped from narrow hips of baseboards, the panes picked clean of too much putty. So spring light pours. We will make things new in the old way, by removal. Wash and sand horsehair plaster until it glows in moonlight. Each chill night, a rat-faced whippoorwill's song has frayed our longing, nourishing our loss of this last impoverished space. When we discover where new paint has dripped and hardened in a sloppy drool, you'll abrade the blemish with a knife and sand it smooth, and I'll feather paint over the wound so well, only we two will ever know the mistake that happened in this place. So, and this is, I guess, the last one I'll read. This is the Kiss Deconstructed. My parents' bedroom walls were papered with cabbage roses, and at each bloom's core, a chocolate drop of an eye I suspected watched in the dark as my parents kissed. My mother, with eyes closed, the way she closed them when they met at the door and kissed each evening. Her lips painted with cherries jubilee, how she closed them. When she stood beside the organ at a funeral and found and held the last note sung hymn as an entire congregation faced their grief. And maybe felt the weight of Christ's long body laid across his mother's in the stained glass of the 13th station. Maybe even grieved the little canticle of rosy flesh where Mary's wrists disappeared under Jesus. Sun burning through her glass face bent over his, branding each mourner's cheek with the thin red gash of her lips. Once, I watched my father lean into my mother's kiss, briefcase still in hand, his face still bright with cold, one arm still caught inside his winter coat, where snowflakes disappeared one by one, like tiny burned out stars. There is always the too bent neck, the draped body, the eyes closed against seeing, or as in Byzantine images, someone gazing at something beyond the frame. The fine black lines that bind each to the other, a gesture to where the losses hide. And I think that's it for me. Is that long enough, Gloria? Was that enough?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Good.
Thank you so much. Really wonderful
Thank you.
work. Thank you. So our next reader is David Surette. He's the author of 6 collections. His latest collection is called Mauldin. He retired a few years ago from teaching and from working in education for 32 years. So I know how it feels. Happy retirement for sure.
Right.
And so I give you David.
Hi, Gloria. Thank you very much for having me, and Miriam for finding me hidden down here in the Cape and inviting me. It was very nice. I'm going to read from Mauldin, which is my latest book. And the magical Mauldin, the Mauldin of my childhood of the 50s, 60s, and a little bit of the 70s. And in my neighborhood in the 60s, all the men seemed really large. They all seemed like big men. And they lived in 3 worlds. They lived in the world of work, the world in family, and in the world of their basements. Mr. Dunphy built a boat in his basement where most men hide their tools, where some men run trains away from their children's hands. Mr. Cronin built a room in his basement, a chair, a reel-to-reel, and a fridge, and he'd sit back and sip and listen and disappear. Mr. Kuhner painted, not the basement, but in his basement, ships and sails and seas, but he wouldn't disappear. He'd sail away from the cries of child number 7. Mr. Tuig built planes from World War I, but not in the basement, in the attic so he could be closer to the sky. And these men were dragon slayers, oil burner tamers, the fiery centers of their homes. But remember Mr. Dunphy's boat? It was too big for the bulkhead. It took a flood to extinguish the flame and prove to the world and his wife that his boat would float. So he sat in it, admiring how it sat in the water. And he waited for the sad hour when the water would recede, the furnace would reignite, and the boat would lie useless, waiting to be torn apart to make way for smaller dreams. The biggest man I knew was my grandfather. And like a lot of men of his generation, he liked to tell us stories of the Great Depression. My grandfather smoked El Productos and ate Almond Joys in his Oldsmobile, littered with boxes and wrappers. His Oldsmobile Cutlass was littered with empty and unopened and half consumed. He never offered either to me, but he did ask me to ride with him. He would use any excuse to drive a fall season reason enough to hit I-93 for some foliage at 65 miles an hour. I remember midnight rides, fiddling with the dials to the far-off stations, pausing at the French from Montreal. Like most guys his age, he talked about the Depression, how he left home at 15 to give his family one less mouth to feed. He shaved in streams, he worked for food, rode the rails, and hitchhiked. He still picked up hitchhikers, felt he owed it to them, welcomed them in with a smile, gripping a monkey wrench on his lap to discourage any monkey business. Once, on the way to Fenway on the subway, a guy was slapping his kid around. My grandfather crossed that train and stood on the kid's foot until the beating stopped. Patted the kid on the head, then sat back next to me, patted my head. Have I ever been that brave? He died before my kids were born, so they and their children can't know how I don't measure up. I eat my share of sweets and can drive for miles and often pat children on the head, but I don't swing much of a monkey wrench. Sometimes life demands both. That's why we have two hands. Limbo. I fainted a lot when I was a kid, mostly in church and school. The votive candles would start to dance and I'd keel over, the wooden pews unforgiving. I wasn't the only one. A woman walking down the center aisle collapsed like my father's folding ruler, the one I wasn't allowed to use. Now, the Immaculate Conception Grammar School was too hot to keep egg salad in a lunchbox, ideals conditioned for passing out. My favorite was in 3rd grade when I blacked out and landed deep in Miss Downing's breast, a kind of heaven. I ended up in the purgatory of the pediatric ward. The kids acted like lifers. They asked me what I was in for, so I faked coma. They planned escapes, tied bed sheets, and crashed model cars in all-night demolition derbies. They scattered at the squeak of nurses' shoes. The doctors glued electrodes to my head, but I never found out why. I knew a kid who was never told he was dying. This is a poem about a kid I was very jealous of, the diabetic. John Conley began every school day by stationing 6 vanilla wafers shrouded in saran wrap on the left corner of his desk with permission to eat them when needed. Now at the Immaculate Conception Grammar School, rules were rules and eating outside of lunch and recess forbidden. But here was John and his daily packet of wafers. Food was precious in those days. I knew my lunch was a peanut butter and jelly on Sunbeam and 2 cookies. Never more, never less. I had never eaten more than 2 cookies at a time, ever. 6 was an extravagance beyond thinking. We gobbled down our lunches without a word, washed down with the slightly sour half pints of milk. The sisters taught us that one of Jesus's great miracles was feeding the masses with 5 loaves and a few small fish. Maybe the miracle was just Jesus sharing what little he had, and that it opened up others to reveal their store of food, and when the sharing was done, there was still more to eat. I can't remember any of us ever sharing, especially John, as he sat content with his huge cache of cookies. Now, one of the things I always told my students was to use proper names of places and people. And I was given a reading at the Mauldin Public Library. When you give a library reading, they always do a question and answer thing afterwards. And first, I asked, anybody have any questions? And a woman stood up and she said, I don't have any questions. And I said, then what do you want to say? And she said, I want to say that I'm John Connolly's mother. So the John Connolly of my poem. Mother came to hear my reading, and then she bought a book, which is another good reason to put people's names in your books. This is Help. If you're of a certain age, that's the Beatles' second movie. And it actually takes place where I currently live. Help. My parents drove us to see Help at the Yarmouth Drive-In. We slalomed down the parking lot, up and down the moguls, until we rested on an embankment that tilted the car, drawing our eyes upward to the screen. My father attached the metal speaker, adjusted the sound. We didn't get popcorn because we never got anything extra, a reminder that we could barely afford to do anything at all. It was a double feature. We suffered through Downhill Racer. I hated Robert Redford. Hated. He was surly and angry, whether skiing or climbing up some woman. I hated how he wrestled her down, devoured her joyless. I promised my 12-year-old self I would never be like that. I wouldn't treat any girl like she was a course to conquer. It took decades to look back on those nights at drive-ins and see how I ran over you. Chasing something ahead of me, some finish line that had nothing to do with you, except how desperate you made me feel. So after a certain point in life, cookies were once the most important thing in my life, and then it was kissing somebody. So I'm going to read my embarrassing first kisses. This is first kiss in the last field, which answers the question, what does kissing have to do with real estate? Before houses crowded between and behind everything, before chain link, before my 11th birthday, before snakes and salamanders disappeared, it was Mr. Feely's backyard, a real yard, crabgrass, crushed stone driveway, and a green garage where he kept a car of curves, swollen as if inflated. Nothing like my father's Finn Fury. We didn't trust him because he had a sign screwed to the front porch of his single-family house, attorney at law. Our fathers, milkmen, mechanics, firemen, policemen, pressmen, bus drivers, wearing their names and jobs, stepped out of two-family homes and kissed our perfumed, beehived, beautiful mothers goodbye. His wife was tissue paper, wrinkled, dry dust. I ran into Feely's field and kissed her. A burst of static electricity so frightening it would be years before I would dare again, and never with her. She moved to Medford, which is a very bad place, because it's just like Mauldin. I once wrote a poem that recommended that you don't teach your children to read or write because they end up writing about you. And I guess the same thing happens, I guess, when I taught my students to write, that they might write about me someday. So this is my poem from my music teacher from 7th grade. She was the sexiest teacher at my junior high, a fact that didn't escape our shop teacher, whom we mocked following her through our cafeteria where we boys sat, a chain link fence between us and the girls. I wondered if it bothered him that the shop teacher always sucked on hard candy and never wiped the spit from the corner of his mouth, and whose only conviction seemed to be that the shop must be swept backwards. On Friday, she let us bring our 45s to play on her record player, the kind that folded into a suitcase. She'd let us bring in our records, but there was one she wouldn't play, The House of the Rising Sun. She said it had dirty lyrics. I couldn't quite figure that, but Eric Burden's moan and the swell of Alan Price's organ playing seemed plenty dangerous to me, and I longed to listen to it in this dull gray classroom with the sexy teacher. She would sometimes strum a guitar and sing, I gave my love a cherry that had no stone. And that sounded pretty sexy to me. But when she sang, sometimes I feel like a motherless child, I'd get aggravated and want the other song, or even better, for her one day to sing The House of the Rising Sun. It's funny when you, well, Miriam just said the great thing about having a book is you do tons of readings and you read in front of lots of different people. And having to tell kids, younger kids, that I actually had a cafeteria where the boys and girls were separated. It was a public school. And then explain things like records and 45s, how important those were. So these are my first records. With my own cash, I bought Carrie Ann and Windy. I was 10, in love with girls' names. At Mary Ann's 12th birthday party in Edgeworth, I danced the fast songs with her, so I was already in when someone spun Moonshadow, and then Hey Jude. I held her all the way through the na-na-na-na-na-na-na-nas. I kept 2 Kennedy half dollars in my top bureau drawer. They were holy like a saint's medal or a scapula. I committed to spend that dollar on her at Buttrick's Ice Cream. She said no. Didn't hear harmonies in her head when she heard my name, but I remember the ice cream stand stood all the way in Medford near the Flynn Ring. I was still 4 years away from driving. Anyway, punching an Octeo and MEX, playing the pop songs of love as I drove someone, just not her, to sweetness. I was lucky enough to spend summers on the Cape. After we lived in Yarmouth, we moved to North Falmouth, to Wild Harbor. And when people, sometimes one of the questions they ask are those question and answer things, where the poems come from. Well, your first kiss is in Feely's Field, and then your next kiss is at Wild Harbor. I think it's all in the names and the places. So this is Wild Harbor. There are a bunch of us, boys and girls on a summer night, whispers and bare feet on the roadway, salt air, time and freedom, the heat of the day hanging around. I went because my older brother told me to. Walk, he said, she'll follow. She went because, I don't know, without a plan, just a direction. Halfway there, I took her hand, the softest thing I had ever felt. We end up facing one another at the seawall by the lifeguard stand. And I may have stood there forever with sand beneath my toes, with the Rolling Stones playing in my head with the lap, lap, lapping, but the lighthouse beam swept the beach, painted her face in beauty. So I leaned in and kissed her. And kissed her all summer. And in the fall, far away from that summer place, I answered the phone and say, hi, Annette. But that wasn't her name. She still hasn't forgiven me. I want to end with a couple of hockey poems. I know that seems crazy in July, but hockey does start August 4th, the Stanley Cup playoffs. I did wear my Colby hockey shirt, just for good luck. And because after cookies and kissing, I guess it was hockey that was most important to me. So I want to read 2 hockey poems. I was lucky to play in an era that we played every game at the Boston Arena, which is this huge arena. So this is called the Boston Arena. It was another penalty in a career of penalties. He chopped the forearms of the winger speeding by. 10 minutes slashing back the ref. The kid snapped. He choked up on his stick, cocked it, and with all his strength sent it helicoptering through the air, clearing the boards, the glass, climber higher and higher, until spinning at its apex, paused, descended, still spinning, cracking a woman in the head, knocking her out. The woman was the kid's mother. What are the odds? He had sent his stick spinning into the stands, all 4,000 waiting seats, maybe 200 occupied, and hit his own mother. The ref tacked on a 10-minute misconduct. Now the rumor spread that after school, the kid hooked up at the mob, collecting, leg breaking. But that was the rumor for every tough Italian kid we knew. But maybe he believed he was fated for the work, foreshadowed by this day, when even his own mother didn't love him. I talked about naming names. I would never put his name in the poem. I'm still afraid of him. So let me finish with a poem actually called Hockey, and it has an epigraph from Thomas O'Grady, who teaches it at UMass Boston. We met during a poetry thing, and we annoyed everybody because he's from Prince Edward Island, Canada, so all we did was talk about hockey. So he wrote How the Worn Jersey of Time Unravels, Thomas O'Grady. My brother lies in a gurney in the catacombs of the Boston Arena, a lightning bolt gash over his right eye. A medical student with an accent stands over him, an open medical book, How to Suture. He tugs the needle and thread through Steve's skin, no anesthesia, no complaints except, hurry up, doc. I don't want to miss the whole period. A Somerville High School fan, unhappy at the 5 goals I scored against them last time, called the rink to tell my coach that my parents are dead. A car accident on the way to the game, because who would play then? It was a lie, exposed by the sight of my parents already in their seats, my dad watching warm-ups, checking the goalie's weaknesses, my mother wishing we played a gentler game. I dragged my son from his bed at 6 a.m., knowing I can have him in his gear before he's awake enough to protest, believing when he slides that puck under the prone goalie, it'll be enough. promised life can't take back. Thanks.
Fabulous, fabulous. Thank you. Karen.
Thank you
That was
so
well
much,
done.
both of you.
Wonderful
That was an
reading.
incredible reading. I really enjoyed it. So, and thank you everyone for coming tonight to hear the readers. I just want to say tomorrow we have 2 fiction readers, Michael C. Keith and Gregory Wallace. And then on Thursday we have RJ Jeffries and Melissa Studdard reading poetry. And then Friday, I'm off, yay. And then Saturday it starts again. So you can check the schedule at the Cervena homepage or on Facebook. And again, thank you so much, everybody. And I hope you have a great night. And thank you.
Thank you, Gloria.
Thank you. Be safe.
Thank you so much.
Gloria.
Okay.
Take care.
Stay safe, everybody.
Mhm.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.